There is a dry dock at Portsmouth where the tide no longer reaches, and in it rests a hull that should, by every ordinary measure of history, have vanished long ago. She is made of oak and elm, of pine and fir bound together by iron and hemp and the patient labor of men who have been dead for more than 2 centuries. Her name is HMS Victory, and she is, at this writing, the oldest commissioned warship still in existence anywhere in the world. Not a replica, not a reconstruction raised from drawings and memory. The ship herself, or enough of her original self that the distinction barely matters, still rests where the Royal Navy placed her, still wears a commissioning pennant, still answers, in a formal and unbroken sense, to orders. She was laid down in the year 1765, in the reign of a king who would later lose an empire in America, and she remains today, patient and improbable, a wooden ghost that never quite agreed to become one. This is the quiet paradox at the center of her story. Ships are not built to last. They are built to serve and to be replaced, and eventually to be broken up for their timber, or left to rot in some forgotten creek, their ribs exposed to the weather, like the bones of something once alive. This was true of nearly every vessel that sailed alongside Victory in her working years. It was true of the ships that fought beside her and the ships that fought against her. Navies of her era built in wood because wood was what the forests gave them, and wood, however carefully chosen and however well maintained, surrenders eventually to rot, to shipworm, to the simple accumulated violence of salt water pressing against a hull for years on end. The average warship of the 18th century might serve for 20 years before she was deemed unfit. Her timbers soft, her frame no longer trustworthy against a heavy sea. Many served far less. Some were lost within a single voyage, taken by storm, or by an enemy's guns, or by the quiet catastrophe of a fire below decks that no crew could contain. The sea does not keep its wooden children long. It borrows them, uses them hard, and then it takes them back. And yet, Victory remains. She outlasted the men who built her, whose names survive now only in yard ledgers and admiralty correspondence. She outlasted the shipwrights who shaped her frames, and the riggers who first strung her miles of rope through blocks and pulleys, and the sailors who first climbed her masts as young men, and if they were fortunate, came down from them as old ones. She outlasted the enemies she was designed to fight. The French Navy that she faced across the water for decades has long since been reorganized, rebuilt, and reorganized again, its 18th century fleet a matter for museums and archives rather than living memory. She outlasted the empire that raised her in the sense that the world which needed a first-rate ship of the line to hold a global network of trade and colonies together no longer exists in the form it once did. Even the wooden warship itself, as a class of vessel, outlasted only barely into the age of steam and iron before it was rendered obsolete by exactly the kind of relentless technological turning that Victory herself had once represented when she was new and vast. How does one ship survive when almost everything around her, the men, the empire, the enemies, the very technology of naval warfare, does not? This is the question this account will follow, slowly, the way a tide follows a shoreline, returning again and again to the same simple wonder from different angles. There is no single answer waiting at the end of it, no one clean explanation that resolves the matter and allows the mind to close the book and move on. Instead, there is a long accumulation of causes, a hull built with unusual care from unusually good timber, at a moment when British naval administration had grown skilled at building well. A career of service so central to national memory that the ship became difficult and eventually impossible. To simply discard a battle so consequential to the history of a nation that the vessel who carried its greatest admiral into it acquired a kind of second life as a relic and a shrine, protected as much by sentiment as by any admiralty budget, and later, in the 20th century, a deliberate campaign of preservation and reconstruction, undertaken by people who understood that what they were saving was not merely a hull, but something closer to a physical memory, a piece of the past that could still be touched, still be walked upon, still be smelled and heard. It is worth pausing here at the start, simply to imagine her as she stands now, before the story moves backward into the forests and the shipyards where she began. Portsmouth at first light, the harbour quiet, gulls turning slowly over masts that have not moved with a real wind in generations. The dry dock holds her, steady, cradled rather than floating, her hull supported along its length so that the ship's own weight does not slowly deform her the way gravity deforms anything left too long without support. Even now, preserved and honoured, she is fighting a version of the same battle that every wooden ship eventually loses. The simple, patient pull of time and mass working against timber that was never meant to bear its own weight indefinitely out of the water that once helped hold it. Climb close to her in the stillness of early morning, and the smell reaches you before the details of her rigging do. Oak holds its scent for centuries if it is kept dry and cared for, and Victory's lower decks still carry the low resinous breath of old timber mingled with tar, with the ghost of gunpowder that soaked into her wood across a working life measured in decades, with a faint mineral tang of iron from her fittings and her guns. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is closer to the smell of a very old church or a long-sealed library, something that speaks quietly of accumulated time rather than of decay. The wood creaks even now, settling in small ways as the temperature shifts through the day, a sound with no clear origin, coming from everywhere and nowhere in the hull at once, the way an old house speaks to itself after dark. Stand on her decks, and the boards are worn smooth in places where feet passed for 2 centuries and more, a polish that no craftsman intended and no varnish could reproduce, laid down, instead, by the simple accumulated friction. It is a strange kind of monument, this ship. She is not a ruin, not quite a museum piece in the way a painting behind glass is a museum piece, because she still, in her formal identity, belongs to an active navy. She is not fully a working vessel either, since she will never again put to sea under her own sail, never again feel a real gale test the soundness of her frame. She exists instead in a category of her own, half relic and half living thing, and it is this peculiar suspended state, more than any single dramatic episode in her service, that makes her worth returning to now, slowly, from the very beginning. Before any of that could happen, though, before the dry dock and the pennant and the quiet crowds who come to walk her decks, there had to be a reason for building a ship of this size and expense at all. There had to be an empire that believed it needed a floating fortress capable of carrying more than 100 guns into the heart of a battle line, and a government willing to spend the equivalent of a small fortune and years of a nation's finest oak to build one. If you find comfort in stories that begin in wonder and unfold without hurry, you are welcome to stay a while longer here, and perhaps to follow this account into the others like it that trace the long, patient histories of the great ships that came before and after her. A gentle subscription costs nothing, and simply keeps this kind of quiet history arriving. For now, though, the story must go back, past the dry dock and the smell of old oak, past the battle that made her famous, back to the middle of the 18th century, when England looked at the world beyond her shores and decided, with the calm confidence of a rising power, to understand why such a ship was ever ordered. It helps to look first at the sea itself and at what it meant to a small island kingdom in the middle years of the 1700s. England was not in that century the largest nation in Europe, nor the wealthiest in land or population, but she had come to depend upon the ocean, the way other powers depended upon their fields and their armies. Her trade moved by water. Her colonies, scattered from the Caribbean to India, were held together only by the ships that crossed between them. And her rivals, chiefly France and Spain, understood this as well as she did, which meant that the contest for empire in this period was, more than anything else, a contest for control of the sea lanes. Wars were fought on the continent, certainly with armies marching across German principalities and Austrian frontiers, but for England, the decisive theatre was almost always the water, and the instrument of that theatre was the navy. The 7 Years' War, which broke out in the middle of the 1750s and would occupy much of the following decade, made this dependence starkly clear. It was fought, in one sense, across the whole known world, in the forests of North America, on the plains of India, along the coasts of West Africa, and in the narrow waters of the English Channel and the Mediterranean. And in nearly every theatre, the outcome hinged on which navy could deliver troops, supplies, and threats to the right place at the right time. England's fleets harassed French convoys, blockaded French ports, and carried expeditions to seize colonies that France could not easily defend without ships of her own to contest the sea. By the time the war ended in the early 1760s, with terms that stripped France of much of her North American empire and confirmed England's growing dominance in India, the lesson had been absorbed thoroughly by those who ran the Admiralty. The war had been won at sea, and the peace that followed would need to be defended there as well. But peace, in the language of naval planners, was rarely more than a pause in preparation. Even as the treaties were signed and as the immediate threat receded, the men who oversaw England's navy understood that France and Spain would rebuild, that the old contest would resume, and that whichever power possessed the stronger fleet, when hostilities returned, would hold the advantage in whatever conflict came next. It was in this atmosphere of watchful calculation, rather than in any single moment of crisis, that the Admiralty turned its attention toward a building program meant to secure England's advantage for a generation to come. New ships were ordered across every class, from small frigates meant for scouting and commerce raiding up, through the great multi-decked vessels meant to anchor the line of battle itself. Among this broader effort, in the closing months of the year 1758, an order was placed for a new first-rate ship of the line to be built at the Royal Dockyard at Chatham on the River Medway, where England had built her greatest vessels for more than a century. To understand what it meant to order a first-rate ship in this period, it helps to understand the rating system that governed the construction and classification of every vessel in the Georgian Navy. Warships of the age were sorted by the number of guns they carried and, correspondingly, by their size and their role in battle. A sixth-rate or fifth-rate vessel was a smaller ship, useful for patrol, escort, or the carrying of dispatches, mounting perhaps 20 to 40 guns across a single deck. Fourth-rates and thirds carried more, 60 to 80 guns typically, and formed much of the workhorse strength of the fleet, capable of standing in the line of battle, but not without risk against larger opponents. Above these stood the second rates, ships of 90 guns or more across 2 full gun decks, powerful vessels reserved for admirals and major engagements. And at the very top of this hierarchy stood the first rate, a ship of 100 guns or more, built across 3 full gun decks, massive in both size and cost, and rare enough that a nation might possess only a handful at any given time. A first-rate ship was not simply a larger version of what came below it. It represented a different order of commitment entirely in timber, in labor, in the years required to build it, and in the ongoing expense of maintaining and crewing it once complete. Such a vessel required upward of 2,000 mature oak trees to construct, drawn from forests that had been managed and watched for exactly this purpose for generations. It required rope makers, sail makers, blacksmiths, and carvers working for years rather than months. It required a crew, once finished, of over 800 men to sail and fight her properly. A small floating town of gunners, topmen, officers, surgeons, and boys barely into their teens. And because of this enormous investment, first rates were built not as ordinary tools of war, but as statements, floating proof of what a nation could achieve when it turned its full resources toward a single hull. To possess a fleet with several first rates among it was to announce to any rival power watching that one's navy operated at the very highest tier of what was possible in the age of sail. It was this kind of statement that the Admiralty had in mind when the order went out in 1758. The ship was to be named Victory, a name that had already been used for earlier vessels in England's naval history, one of them lost decades before in a storm with all hands, but a name that carried, nonetheless, a kind of confident optimism that suited the moment. She was to be built to what was called the 1745 establishment, a set of specifications that governed the dimensions and gun arrangements of first-rate ships at the time, and she was meant, from her earliest conception, to represent not merely another vessel added to the fleet, but the pinnacle of what English naval architecture could produce for her age, a ship built to project power not simply across the Channel or the North Sea, but across oceans to wherever England's interests and rivals happened to meet. And yet, even as this ambitious order was placed, a quieter and more practical problem sat behind it, one that had less to do with strategy or prestige and more to do with the simple stubborn material from which such ships were made. England's supply of mature oak, the enormous slow-grown trees required for the keel, the frames, and the massive curved timbers called compass timber that gave a hull its strength, had been dwindling for years, consumed by decades of continuous shipbuilding and by the ordinary demands of a growing nation that needed wood for houses, for fences, for fuel. Single first-rate ship might require the felling of trees that had stood, in some cases for a century or more, oaks whose curved growth patterns happened to match the particular angles needed for a ship's ribs and knees, trees that could not simply be planted and grown to order, but had to be found already mature. Cotti, scattered across the forests and estates of southern England. Foresters and naval timber agents had begun decades earlier to travel the countryside, marking such trees for future use. Slow and patient system of supply that was now, by the late 1750s, showing signs of real strain. This scarcity gave a certain quiet urgency to the decision to build Victory when the Admiralty did. It was not merely that England wanted a great ship, it was that the raw material for building great ships was becoming harder to secure with each passing year. And if a first rate of this scale was to be built at all, it made a certain unspoken sense to begin the gathering and the felling while there remained forests capable of supplying it. There was no dramatic announcement of scarcity, no public alarm over vanishing oaks. The concern moved instead through the quieter channels of dockyard correspondence and timber inventories, through the calculations of men whose job it was to know, years in advance, whether enough suitable wood could be found for the ships already promised to the fleet, tan. But it was there, this understanding that England's naval strength rested upon a resource that could not be replenished quickly, and that the golden age of building ships like Victory might not last indefinitely. And so, in the closing months of 1758, with the war against France still being fought across 3 continents, an order went quietly into the record books at Chatham dockyard, and the forests of southern England began to be searched, tree by tree, for the timber that would become a giant. A ship of this size did not begin with a keel or with the ring of hammers, or with the calls of shipwrights across a dockyard. It began, instead, in quiet groves and hedgerows, in the slow accumulation of decades that no single lifetime could account for. Before Victory could be a ship, she had first to be a forest, and the forest had to be found. The figure that survives in the record books is a startling one, though it was spoken of at the time with the same flat practicality that attended any inventory of stores or cordage. Roughly 6,000 mature oak trees would be required to build a ship of Victory's rate, enough timber to cover some 60 acres of England, had the trees been left standing where they grew. It is a strange thing to hold in the mind that a single hull, however vast, however many decks it carried, however many guns it would eventually run out through her sides, had first to consume so great a portion of a living landscape. 60 acres. Woods that a man might walk through in an afternoon, that deer might shelter in, that villagers might gather fallen branches from for 100 winters, all of it destined, tree by tree, for the frames and planking of a single ship. Oak was chosen not for its beauty, though English oak has always possessed a certain severe beauty of its own, but for its strength, its density, and above all its capacity to be shaped. Shipwrights needed timber that would resist the working of the sea for decades, wood that would not rot swiftly in salt water, that would hold a fastening, that would bend without splitting when steamed and coaxed into the compound curves a hull demanded. English oak, grown slowly in the damp, mineral-rich soils of Sussex, Kent, and Hampshire, had long been prized for exactly these qualities. But more than straight, tall timber was needed. The most valuable trees, in the particular language of naval architecture, were not the trunks alone, but the crooked ones, trees that had grown with natural bends in their limbs and boles, for it was these curves, uncut and unforced, that gave a ship's frame its greatest strength. A knee of oak, grown naturally into an angle, was worth more to a shipwright than any amount of straight timber, for the grain ran unbroken through the bend. An unbroken grain meant a frame that would not fail under the working of the sea. Finding such trees required more than an axe and a willing hand. It required in effect a kind of forestry that had been practiced in England for generations before Victory was ever conceived. Landowners who planted oaks, not for their own use but for their grandchildren's. Foresters who marked certain trees decades in advance for the Navy's eventual need. Surveyors who walked woodland after woodland with an eye trained to see, in the twist of a branch or the spread of a bole, the eventual curve of a ship's futtock or knee. It has been said and repeated so often that it has become a kind of quiet legend among those who study the age of sail, that some of the oaks felled for Victory may have been planted as much as a century before her keel was laid, acorns pressed into English soil during the reign of an earlier monarch. Grown to maturity through wars, their planters never lived to see, waiting, without any of the intention we might romantically assign to them, for a purpose that would not arrive until long after the hands that planted them had gone still. The felling itself was seasonal work, governed by the same rhythms that governed all timber work in that century. Trees were customarily felled in winter, when the sap had withdrawn and the wood was at its driest and most stable, and when the labor of hauling great trunks from forest to road was made marginally easier by frozen ground. Teams of sawyers and woodsmen moved through the assigned woodlands with saws and axes, guided by the marks that surveyors had left months or years before, and one by one the great trees came down. Slowly, for a mature oak does not fall quickly even under skilled hands, for a badly felled tree could crack or split in ways that ruined the very qualities that made it valuable in the first place. Once felled, the timber could not simply be carried to the dockyard and worked. Oak needed to season sometimes for years before it was fit for a ship's frame, and the great stacks of drying timber in a naval yard were themselves a kind of quiet monument to patience. Mountains of wood, laid in careful order, spaced to allow air to move between the pieces, dashed to dry slowly so that the wood would not warp or split once it was finally cut and fastened into a hull. Some of the timber gathered for Victory had in fact already been seasoning in the yards at Chatham for years before her keel was ever laid down, held in reserve against exactly this kind of need, so that when the order finally came in the closing months of 1758, the dockyard was not beginning entirely from nothing. Still, a great deal of new timber had to be found, felled and set to season, and the work of gathering enough oak for a ship of this size would continue for years, even as construction itself began. Timber arriving by cart and by barge, moving down the rivers and along the roads of southern England toward the yard. A slow and constant tide of wood, feeding a project that would take the better part of a decade to complete. At Chatham, the dockyard itself was already an old institution by the time Victory's timbers began arriving, a place that had built and repaired the ships of the English Navy for the better part of 2 centuries, its slipways and mast ponds and rope walks arranged along the banks of the Medway in a manner that had grown over generations into a kind of small industrial city devoted entirely to the making of ships. It was here that the master shipwright, assigned to Victory's construction, a man trained in a tradition of naval architecture that stretched back through generations of English shipbuilders, would oversee the translation of an established design into an actual standing hull. The design itself followed principles that had been refined over decades of English ship construction: the particular proportions of length to beam, the placement of the gun decks, the shape of the hull below the waterline that gave a first-rate both the stability to carry her guns and the speed to maneuver them into position. These were not principles invented anew for Victory, but a tradition passed down through generations of master shipwrights, each building upon the accumulated experience of those before them, adjusting proportions here and there based on how earlier ships had performed, but never departing radically from a body of knowledge that had been tested, ship by ship, across a century of naval warfare. Beneath the master shipwright worked a great hierarchy of craftsmen and labourers, each with a trade suited to a particular stage of the ship's construction. Sawyers working in pairs over pits dug into the yard spent their days reducing great trunks into usable planks and beams, a laborious and exhausting task that produced the raw material every other trade depended upon. Joiners shaped and fitted timber with a precision that the eventual strength of the hull would depend upon, cutting scarfs and joints that would lock great balks of oak together into single, unified pieces of framing. Riggers, though their work would not truly begin until the hull itself was farther along, were already among those employed at the yard, preparing cordage and beginning the long process of gathering the enormous quantities of rope a ship of this size would eventually require. Blacksmiths worked at forges within the yard, producing the iron bolts, straps, and fastenings that would hold the great timbers together, work that demanded its own kind of exacting patience, for a poorly forged bolt could fail decades later, deep within a hull, far from any hand that might repair it. All of this labor moved at a pace that modern eyes might find difficult to imagine, not the frantic urgency of a single deadline, but the steady, accumulating rhythm of work that everyone involved understood would take years, perhaps a decade, to complete. There was no shortcut to seasoned oak, no way to hurry a tree's growth or compress the month the beam needed to dry before it could be trusted to hold a ship together in a storm. And so the dockyard at Chatham settled in the years that followed that quiet order of 1758 into a long and patient labor, carts arriving with timber, sawyers bent over their pits, joiners fitting the first great pieces of frame, blacksmiths forging fastenings by the thousand, all of it moving toward a keel that had not yet been laid. A ship that existed, for now, only as timber, tradition, and the accumulated patience of hundreds of hands. On the 14th of July, in the year 1759, that patience, found its first true expression. The keel of the ship that would become Victory was laid down upon the blocks at Chatham, and with that act, however quietly it was performed, however little ceremony attended it, the vessel passed from an idea, sustained by timber stores and admiralty orders, into something that could, at last, be called a ship under construction. There were no crowds for this. There was no band, no speech, no gathering of dignitaries to mark the moment. A keel laying was a working event, attended by shipwrights and overseers, and its significance lay not in spectacle, but in the fact that everything afterward would be built upon this single spine of elm, scarfed together in sections and bolted with a care that reflected exactly what was being asked of it, to bear, for as long as the ship should last, the whole immense weight of oak and iron and canvas and men that would eventually rise above it. The keel itself was a modest thing to look at, laid low upon the blocks, a long straight timber assembly running the length of what would become the ship's bottom. But everything about the vessel above it had already been determined by the requirements of a first rate, and those requirements were considerable. She was designed to be some 227 feet in length along her upper gun deck, with a beam of just over 51 feet, proportions calculated not for grace alone, but for the brutal practical need to carry 3 full decks of guns and still remain seaworthy, still survive the batterings of an Atlantic gale or the recoil of 100 cannon fired in a single broadside. Her displacement, fully laden and armed, would come to somewhere near 3,800 tons, a figure that meant little to the sawyers cutting frames in the yard, but meant everything to the admiralty that had ordered her, for it was in tonnage and gun count that a nation's naval strength was measured and compared, ship for ship. Against the fleets of France and Spain, a first rate in the classification of the day meant a ship of 100 guns or more, arranged across 3 decks. And this classification was not a matter of prestige alone. It dictated the entire logic of the hull, how thick the timbers must be to bear the weight of 3 tiers of ordnance, how the frames must be shaped to distribute that weight without the ship hogging at bow and stern under her own mass, how the lower deck must sit close enough to the waterline to keep the heaviest guns low and the ship stable, yet high enough to be worked in a swell without the sea pouring in through the gun ports. Every dimension chosen at Chatham was an answer to this problem, and the keel laid down in July was the first line drawn in timber toward its solution. From the keel, the work rose. Stem and sternpost were raised at either end, curving upward to define the ship's profile from bow to stern. Then, piece by piece, the frames began to go up, great curved timbers, each one built not from a single piece of wood, but from several, joined and bolted together because no tree in England grew in the shape a ship's rib required. This was the particular genius and the particular burden of English shipbuilding in that century. A hull of this size could not be built from straight timber alone. It demanded compass timber, wood grown crooked by nature, oak that had spent decades bending itself around a slope or reaching sideways for light, so that when it was finally felled and cut, its natural curve matched the curve the shipwright needed. Finding enough of this crooked timber in the right sizes was as much a part of building Victory as any sawing or joining that followed. And it was one further reason the whole enterprise moved with such unhurried care. A straight plank could be cut to any length a saw allowed. A ship's frame could not be forced into being. It had to be found, growing somewhere in a wood, shaped by decades no shipwright controlled. As the frames rose along the length of the keel, one after another, the ship began to take on the appearance the yard workers and passers-by would have recognized as a hull, not yet planked, not yet closed in, but readable. Now as a shape, a ribcage of oak standing open to the sky, each frame set close against its neighbor, braced and shored. The whole skeleton held together by an internal logic that only the master shipwright and his senior men fully carried in their heads. It is worth pausing on this image, for it is the one most easily lost when a finished ship is later admired in her paint and rigging for months and then for years. Victory existed as this open frame, a vast lattice of curved timber standing in the dock at Chatham, unroofed, unplanked, exposed to rain and sun and the slow English seasons, looking for all the world like the bones of some enormous creature laid out for study, rather than a vessel meant to cross oceans and fight battles. Visitors to the yard in those years would have walked beneath ribs taller than a man, would have heard the ring of adzes and the rasp of saws. From within the frame itself would have seen daylight, passing clean through where, eventually, oak planking would seal the hull against the sea. The construction of a first-rate at this scale was never expected to be quick, and Victory's timeline bore this out fully. From the keel laying in 1759, the work continued for years, following the seasons of felling and the rhythms of the dockyard, but it also followed something less predictable, the fortunes of the war that had called her into being. The 7 Years' War, which had made a 100-gun ship seem so urgent a necessity in the winter of '58, began to wind toward its conclusion as the 18 months and then the years passed. By the time significant progress had been made on her hull, the pressure that had justified her had already begun to ease. The war that Britain had feared losing was instead being won decisively at sea and in the colonies alike, and the fleet that had seemed so dangerously thin against France's numbers now looked considerably less imperiled. By 1763, when the Treaty of Paris brought the war to its formal end, Victory's hull stood largely complete in frame and partially planked. A great deal of labour already invested in her, but with no immediate need pressing the Admiralty to rush her final fitting out, launch her and commission her for a war that no longer existed. And so a curious stillness settled over the ship. She was left essentially to season. Her timbers, already cut and shaped and fastened, allowed to stand and dry and settle further under cover, which was in truth no great loss and arguably no accident at all, for well-seasoned timber made a stronger and longer-lived hull than wood rushed into service still green with sap. Shipwrights of the period understood this, and there was a long tradition of allowing a hull to stand part-built if time permitted, since the slow drying of oak under roof did more to strengthen a ship than any amount of urgency could. But there is something quietly strange all the same in picturing this vessel, designed at the outer edge of what the age believed a fighting ship should be, built specifically to answer the darkest fears of a nation at war, standing instead in patient half-completion through years of peace, her frames closed in under a roof at Chatham. Her decks not yet laid, her guns not yet cast for her, waiting for a conflict that had, for the moment, ended. There is a kind of humility in this pause that suits the ship's later reputation better than any tale of urgent, uninterrupted labour might have. She was not born in a single burst of wartime desperation and rushed to sea, half-finished, as many vessels of necessity were. She was allowed instead the years her timber required, set aside when the war that justified her had passed, and left to stand, patient, incomplete, unnamed even, in some of the earliest records, while the world above the dockyard walls moved on without her. It would be more than a decade yet before she was ready to take the water, and in that gap between the laying of her keel and the day she finally slid down the ways, something of her later endurance was perhaps already being quietly built into her, timber by seasoned timber, in the stillness of a half-finished hull, waiting out a war's uncertain peace. What no shipwright could have intended, and what no Admiralty planner had budgeted for, was the peculiar gift that idleness gave her. A ship built quickly, in the ordinary press of wartime urgency, was a ship built from timber cut and shaped and fastened within a season or two of the trees felling, wood, still carrying its moisture, still settling into its new form, still prone in later years to the slow rot that came from sap trapped within a plank never given time to breathe. Victory's timbers had no such haste forced upon them. They lay stacked in the yard at Chatham through the seasons of a peace that no one had expected to last, drying slowly under open sheds, turning from green wood to something harder and more stable, something that would take a fastening and hold it, that would flex under the strain of a following sea without splitting along some hidden fault line laid down in careless cutting. Later historians, looking back across a century and more of her service, would point to this long delay as one of the quiet reasons she endured, where other ships of her age did not by any design of the men who ordered her built, but by the simple accident of a war that ended before the wood was ready and did not resume until the wood had finished becoming, in its own unhurried way, exactly what a hull needed it to be. There is a kind of irony in this that the age itself would have appreciated had anyone paused to articulate it. The 7 Years' War had summoned her into existence, had provided the political urgency and the naval necessity that justified laying down a first rate at such expense. Then the war had simply stopped. The Peace of Paris signed in the winter of 1763, France and Britain stepping back from a conflict that had spread from the forests of North America to the coasts of India, and the fleet that Britain had been building toward suddenly seemed less urgent. The great hull in her dock at Chatham suddenly less pressing. She sat. The scaffolding around her frames grew familiar to the yard workers who passed it daily, a fixture of the dockyard landscape rather than a project demanding completion. Grass grew, in some tellings, along the edges of the slipway where mud had once been churned by constant labor. She was, for those years, less a ship being built than a ship being allowed to season, allowed to wait, allowed to become through inactivity what she might never have become through haste. But peace between nations that had fought as bitterly and as globally as Britain and France had never been more than a pause, and by the early 1770s, the old tensions were stirring again, quieter at first, then less quiet. As France began rebuilding her own navy and casting glances toward Britain's colonies in a manner that suggested the peace would not hold indefinitely. It was in this climate, watchful, uneasy, the old rivalry reasserting itself beneath the surface calm, that orders came down once more to Chatham, and the yard that had grown quiet around the great unfinished hull stirred back into purpose. Workers returned in greater numbers. The scaffolding that had stood for years as a kind of monument to postponement was climbed again with fresh intent. The hull, which had sat through a decade of English weather absorbing the discipline of time, was finally to be finished. The resumption brought with it a different energy than the original laying of the keel had carried. Where that first work had been slow and exploratory, the careful assembly of a design still proving itself in 3 dimensions, this later phase moved with the confidence of a shape already established, a skeleton that only needed its remaining flesh. Planking went up along both sides of the hull in earnest now, thick oak boards curved and fitted to the frames beneath, each one selected and shaped by shipwrights who had spent their careers learning to read the grain of wood the way a physician might read a patient's pulse, knowing where a plank would bend easily to the hull's curve and where it would need coaxing, steaming, patient persuasion before it would lie flat against the ribs beneath it. The outer layer went on first, the skin that would meet the sea directly, and then, deck by deck, the internal planking that would give the ship her floors, her gun decks, her orlop, where the surgeons would one day work by lantern light, far below the waterline. The decking itself required its own separate patience. Oak was used again, thick enough to bear the weight of guns that would eventually number over 100. Each deck laid in long runs of planking corked tightly at every seam, for a deck that leaked was a deck that rotted the frames beneath it, and a first-rate ship of the line could not afford weakness in structures meant to bear such loads for decades. The masts, meanwhile, existed still only in miniature at this stage. Smaller versions crafted and tested to confirm proportions before the vast spars themselves. Some of them, assembled from multiple pieces of the finest fur brought from the Baltic, could be raised into position. A ship of Victory's rate would eventually carry masts rising well over 200 feet from keel to truck, and no shipwright committed to placing such towering, costly, and irreplaceable timber into a hull until every measurement had been proven correct on a smaller scale first. The great masts themselves would not go up until closer to launch, and in some accounts not fully until after she had taken the water and lay alongside a fitting-out wharf. But their positions, their rake, their exact relationship to keel and deck were being calculated and confirmed even now, in these final years of construction. Through models and careful mathematics passed down through generations of naval architects. It was the caulking, though, that occupied perhaps the most unglamorous and most essential of all the labor in these final years, the packing of oakum, twisted and teased fibers of old rope into every seam between every plank, driven home with mallet and caulking iron by men whose hands had grown thick and calloused with the repetition of it. Seam after seam, deck after deck, hull plank after hull plank, until the entire vast surface of the ship, above the waterline and below it, had been made as tight as human patience and craft could make it. Over this went the pitch, heated and thinned and worked into the seams to seal them against the sea, black and pungent labor that left the yards smelling for months of tar and resin, the scent that would come to define naval dockyards across the age of sail as surely as the ring of the caulking mallet defined its sound. Below the waterline, where wood met salt water in a battle that never ended so long as the ship swam, additional protection was applied, layers intended to slow the relentless attack of shipworm, the small marine creature that could riddle an unprotected hull with tunnels and reduce good oak to something closer to sponge within a few years of tropical service. Every plank below that waterline, every seam, every joint was inspected and sealed with the understanding that a ship meant to serve for decades, in waters from the cold Atlantic to the warm seas of the Mediterranean and beyond, would only be as durable as the least attention paid to any single foot of her hull. This was labor without glamour, performed by men whose names went largely unrecorded, whose work would never be praised in any account of a battle or celebrated in any ballad, and yet whose care in these final years determined, as much as any decision made in an admiralty office, whether the ship above them would still be afloat a century later. The shipwrights and caulkers and riggers who filled Chatham's yard through these renewed years of labor were finishing something that had waited through a war's absence to be completed. A hull grown patient through disuse now being made whole, with the urgency of a nation once again eyeing France across the Channel with something less than confidence in the peace. And as the planking neared completion, as the decks were laid and caulked and pitched, as the miniature masts confirmed their proportions and the great spars themselves waited nearby to be raised, there remained still the question that had loomed over every ship of this size built in England's yards before her, the question of how so vast and heavy a hull, built now almost entirely of solid oak, grown dense with a decade's seasoning, was to be moved at all, coaxed down a slipway and into open water without breaking apart under her own tremendous weight, or refusing to move, or moving too fast and grounding herself before she ever properly floated. That moment, still some months distant, would test everything the years of careful, unhurried building had achieved. On the 7th of May, in the year 1765, that moment came. Chatham dockyard had been readying itself for weeks. The way a household readies itself for a wedding, it has waited long enough to see arrive that it has almost stopped believing in the date. The shipwrights had checked and rechecked the launching ways, the great greased timbers down which the hull would slide, testing them for any warp or unevenness that might catch a hull of this weight and turn a triumph into a disaster. The tide had been studied with the same patience that had gone into the felling of the Oaks a decade before, for a hull this large could not simply be launched on any convenient morning. It required a spring tide, one of the highest of the year, when the Medway would rise far enough up the slipway to receive so deep and heavy a vessel without leaving her stranded, keel fast in mud, in front of the very crowd gathered to watch her float. The shipwrights and the master builders had done their arithmetic with care, consulting the almanacs, watching the moon, waiting for the water to align itself with the ship, the way it had aligned itself with every great hull launched from an English yard before her. The people of Chatham and the towns beyond had come down to the river in numbers that the dockyard had not seen for years. Some said, not since the launching of a great ship a generation before. They came in their Sunday clothes, though it was not a Sunday. Farmers and merchants and dockyard families standing shoulder to shoulder along both banks. Children lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Sailors on leave mixing with men who had never set foot on a ship larger than a fishing boat and would likely never set foot on one again. There was music, by most accounts, and there was drink, and there was the particular hush that falls over even a noisy crowd when something is about to happen that cannot be undone once it begins. Above them all rose the hull itself, propped in her cradle on the slipway, her black and honey-colored timbers catching the low morning light, 3 great tiers of empty gun ports still unpierced by cannon, her decks still bare of masts, looking less like a ship than like some vast wooden creature waiting to be released into an element it had never yet touched. The order was given, and the blocks and shores that had held her upright through nearly 6 years of building were struck away one by one, the shipwrights moving with the same unhurried care that had marked every stage of her construction, none of them rushing despite the thousands of eyes now fixed upon their hands. And then, for a long moment, nothing happened at all. She did not move. It is one of the quieter, stranger facts recorded of that day that the ship built to be the largest and most formidable in the fleet, greased and shored and timed to the exact rise of a spring tide, simply sat where she was, refusing the water that had been prepared so carefully to receive her. The crowd, by the accounts that survive, did not know quite what to make of the pause. Whether it was ordinary, whether it was cause for alarm, whether some flaw hidden deep in her frame had finally declared itself at the worst possible moment. The shipwrights, however, seem not to have panicked. They had built ships before that hesitated on the ways, had learned that a hull of such weight sometimes needed persuading rather than force, that the answer to a stuck launch was rarely more haste, but more grease, more patience, a widening of the ways, a careful re-examination of where the weight was settling and why. Men moved along the cradle with barrels of tallow and soft soap, working it into the timbers of the slipway by hand, doing the unglamorous labor of loosening what the tide alone could not, and then, all at once, she went. The hull that had refused to move began to slide, slowly at first, and then with a gathering speed that must have seemed to those standing closest both wonderful and faintly terrifying, 100 feet of oak and iron. Finding the water for the first time, the noise of her passage down the ways audible over the crowd's response. Until at last, her stern took the river, and she rode for the first time in her existence upon the element she had been built to master. She did not break apart. She did not ground herself in the mud of the Medway. She floated low and steady, exactly as the draftsman at Deptford had promised she would, when they first laid ink to the design a decade before. It was in that same year, 1765, that her name was chosen, and the choice was not an idle one. England had, in the recent past, known a run of victories on land and at sea, across a decade of conflict that had expanded her reach and confirmed, in the minds of many at the Admiralty, that Britain's future lay upon the water. To name a new first-rate victory in such a year was to make of her a kind of monument before she had ever fired a gun in anger. A vessel meant to carry forward in wood and paint and gilding the memory of triumphs already won. It was a name freighted with expectation, chosen not for what she had done, but for what she was meant to represent. The confidence of a nation that believed its finest ships should be given names equal to its finest hours. And yet, the great irony of Victory's beginning is this. Having been built at such expense, having been given so weighty and hopeful a name, having been floated at last upon the Medway before thousands who had come to see her christened into service, she was not, in fact, made ready for war. She was not fitted with her full suit of masts. She was not manned. She was not sent to sea. Instead, once the excitement of the launch had passed and the crowds had gone home to their farms and their trades, Victory was moved quietly into what the Navy of the time called ordinary. Laid up, her lower masts perhaps stepped, but her upper rigging struck down, her gun ports empty, a skeleton crew or none at all aboard to see to her most basic maintenance. She sat, in other words, exactly where a ship least wants to sit, finished, floating, named, and entirely unused. For this was the peculiar arithmetic of naval planning in that era. The war that had prompted her design, the long conflict that had emptied England's forests of oak and filled her yards with new keels, had ended before her hull was even complete. There was, in the year of her launch, no war for her to fight, no fleet in urgent need of a new first rate to bring the numbers up to strength. And so the largest and finest ship in the Chatham yard, a vessel that had taken the better part of 6 years and the wood of thousands of trees to build, was left to ride quietly at her moorings, her decks silent, her guns not yet aboard, waiting for a conflict that had not yet been declared, against an enemy who did not yet exist. There is something almost wistful in this, when it is considered slowly rather than rushed past a warship, built at extraordinary cost and with extraordinary care, sitting idle year upon year in the reaches of the Medway while the world outside her hull went on without her. She had been given a name meant to evoke past glories, and yet her own glory, the battle that would in time make her name outlast every ship built alongside or after her, still lay decades in the future, so distant that none of the men who had felled her timber or shaped her frames or watched her slide down the ways. She was, for those years, simply a very large and very expensive form of patience, a ship in waiting, moored and silent, her purpose deferred, her true history not yet begun. It would be many years, and much had to happen in Europe and at sea, before Victory was finally called upon to become what her name had always promised she might be. For the first years after her launching, Victory did not sail at all. She rode instead at her moorings in the Medway, and later in the still waters off Chatham, her lower masts unstepped, her upper decks stripped bare of the rigging that would one day carry her through storm and battle alike. To a visitor rowed out to look at her in those years, she would have seemed less a ship than a kind of floating warehouse, vast and silent, her gun ports closed, her figurehead staring out over water she did not yet need to cross. She had been built for a war that had already ended before her keel was fully laid, and now she waited, as so many great ships of her era were made to wait for the next war to arrive and give her purpose. This was not neglect, though to an untrained eye it might have looked like it. The Navy of that century had learned, through long and costly experience, that a ship of the first rate could not simply be built and then abandoned to the weather. Her enormous hull, still full of moisture from newly seasoned timber, needed to breathe and settle slowly, lest she warp or rot before she had fired a single gun in anger. And so she was kept in what the Navy called ordinary laid up, but not forgotten, tended by a skeleton crew of standing officers who lived aboard her through all those quiet years. A boatswain, a carpenter, a gunner, and a handful of men beneath them, whose duty was simply to see that she did not decay. They pumped her bilges, they checked her seams for the first signs of rot. They aired her below decks when the weather allowed, opening her hatches to let the trapped damp escape, and closed them again when storms threatened to fill her holds with rain. It was unglamorous work, entirely without incident, and it went on for the better part of a decade. There is something almost meditative in imagining those years, a hull larger than any building most Englishmen of the time would ever enter, floating quietly at anchor, visited only by gulls and the occasional rowing boat, guarded against nothing so much as time itself. She had cost the nation a sum that could have built a small town, and for years she earned nothing but the wages of the few men who kept her afloat. It is easy, looking back from an age that measures worth in immediate returns, to see this as waste. But the naval mind of the 18th century understood something else, that a first-rate ship of the line was not built for the war at hand, but for the war after that, and the one after that again, an investment not in a single campaign, but in the whole uncertain future of a maritime nation that could never know when it might next need every gun it could muster. That need arrived, as such things generally do, without much warning and with considerable inconvenience. Through the 1770s, England's American colonies had grown restless under taxation and governance imposed from across an ocean, and what began as a matter of pamphlets and petitions hardened by the middle of the decade into open rebellion. At first, this seemed a colonial matter, to be settled with soldiers and a modest naval presence off the American coast. But wars in that century rarely stayed contained to their original quarrel, and this one did not either. France, still nursing the old grievance of her earlier defeat, saw in America's rebellion an opportunity to strike at Britain by proxy, and in 1778 she entered the war openly on the American side. Spain followed not long after, and the Dutch Republic after that, until what had begun as a dispute over tea and taxation had become within a few years something closer to a world war, fought not only in American waters, but across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Channel itself. It was this widening of the conflict, the sudden reappearance of French and Spanish battle fleets as a genuine threat to Britain's own shores, that at last called victory out of her long sleep. The calculation that had justified building her 10 years before, the fear of a combined Bourbon fleet appearing in the Channel, was no longer a distant hypothetical, but a present and pressing danger. Orders went out from the Admiralty for her to be brought forward for active service, and the quiet years of ordinary gave way, almost overnight by naval standards, to the noise and labor of fitting out. To bring a ship of her size from a laid-up hulk to a fully commissioned man of war was itself no small undertaking. Her lower masts, which had lain for years in the mast ponds at Chatham, seasoning further in salt water, were stepped back into her hull with the aid of sheer hulks and gangs of riggers who knew the particular stubbornness of first-rate spars. Miles of new cordage were rove through her blocks. Her sails, cut and stitched in the sail lofts ashore, were bent onto her yards. Her guns, the great 32-pounders of her lower deck, the 24-pounders of her middle, and the lighter pieces above, were hoisted aboard and run out through gun ports that had stood empty and closed for the better part of a decade. Provisions came aboard in an endless procession of casks and sacks: salt beef, ship's biscuit, dried peas, small beer by the ton, enough to feed a company that would eventually number well over 800 men. Slowly, over the course of many weeks, the silent hulk that had sat at her moorings became once again what she had been built to be: a working ship, crowded, noisy, and alive. Her first commission, in 1778, placed her under the flag of Admiral Augustus Keppel, and it was in this role, as flagship, the vessel from which an admiral commanded not merely his own crew but an entire fleet, that Victory would spend nearly all of her active career. This was, in fact, the particular purpose of a ship of her class. The Navy's rating system divided its ships of the line according to the number of guns they carried, and Victory, mounting 100 guns across 3 full decks, stood at the very top of that system as a first-rate, the largest, most heavily armed, and most expensive class of vessel the Navy built. There were, at any given time, only a handful of such ships in commission, and they were reserved, almost without exception, for the use of admirals whose broad pennants or flags would be hoisted at the mainmast to signal that a fleet's commander was aboard. To serve as a first-rate was to serve, in effect, as a floating headquarters, a ship built not simply to fight, though she could certainly do that, but to carry the weight of command itself, with cabins and space enough for an admiral and his staff, and decks wide enough to signal an entire fleet's maneuvers from her rigging. Under Keppel, Victory saw her first taste of general fleet action in an inconclusive but bruising encounter with the French off Ushant in the summer of 1778, a battle remembered less for its outcome than for the bitter court-martial controversy it provoked among the officers involved. A foretaste of how closely the reputations of admirals and the ships that carried them would remain entangled in the years ahead. She would go on to serve under a succession of further admirals as the war ground on through its later years, carrying the flags of men whose names are now half-remembered outside naval histories, but who each in turn relied upon her decks and her guns and her size to hold together the fragile discipline of a fleet at sea. She took part in the long, difficult effort to keep open the supply lines to Gibraltar, then under siege by the combined forces of France and Spain, and saw further action as the war stumbled toward its uneasy conclusion in 1783, with American independence secured and the old European balance only briefly restored. That peace, like most peace of the era, would not last. And so it was that Victory's career, having begun with one call to arms in a war she was built too late to fight, and continued through another she had joined only in its middle years, now stood at the threshold of decades more of service still to come, decades that would carry her through further wars, further admirals, and further battles, each adding its weight to a reputation that had, until now, been built almost entirely on potential rather than proof. The quiet years in ordinary were behind her. What lay ahead, though none aboard her could yet have known its shape, was a run of service longer and more consequential than almost any ship of her class would ever see, stretching forward toward a single autumn morning off a Spanish cape that would fix her name and one admiral's into the permanent memory of the nation that had built her. But before that morning could arrive, there was simply the ship and the long, ordinary business of living within her, which occupied far more of her existence than any single battle ever would. To walk her decks in those years was to walk through a small, floating town, one built to a purpose so total that almost nothing within her had not been shaped by the demands of war, and yet one that also had, tucked into its corners, the same small comforts and irritations that might be found in any crowded community ashore. Victory was rated a first rate, the highest classification the Navy gave, reserved for ships carrying at least 100 guns across 3 full gun decks, and hers numbered above 100 by most counts, arranged in graduated weights from the heaviest at the bottom to the lightest near the top. a distribution dictated by the need to keep her center of gravity low enough that she would not roll herself over in a heavy sea. On the lower gun deck sat her 32-pounders guns, so heavy that each required a crew of some 14 men to load, run out, fire, and haul back for reloading. The whole choreographed sequence, repeated as many times in a battle as strength and nerve allowed. Above them on the middle deck sat 24-pounders, and above those, on the upper gun deck, 12-pounders. Lighter again, the logic of the arrangement holding throughout. Heaviest low, lightest high, the ship built almost like a wedding cake of iron and oak, each tier lighter than the one beneath it. To man, all this took people in numbers that are difficult, even now, to hold comfortably in the mind. Victory in her fighting configuration carried something in the region of 800 men, a population larger than many English towns of the period, packed into a hull some 227 feet in length, its living space compressed further still by the guns, the stores, the rigging gear, and the countless other necessities of a ship meant to remain at sea unsupported, for months at a stretch. Between decks, the headroom was low enough that a man of even modest height would have to stoop beneath the deck beams, and privacy, in any sense a later age would recognize it, barely existed at all. Most of the crew slept in hammocks slung so close together that a man's shoulder might brush his neighbor's on either side. The hammocks themselves stowed by day along the rails, where, according to the practice of the time, they also served as a kind of makeshift armor against splinters. Tightly rolled canvas, packed hard enough to stop a musket ball. The rhythm of a day at sea followed the watch system. The crew divided into groups that rotated through 4-hour periods of duty and rest around the clock, so that the ship was never without hands awake and working, whatever the hour. Bells rung out the passage of each half-hour, a system old by Victory's time and unchanged for generations, so that a sailor might tell the time to within 30 minutes without ever consulting a clock, simply by counting the strikes. Meals came at fixed points in this rhythm, prepared in a galley that had to feed hundreds from limited stores. Salted meat and hard biscuit forming the staple of a diet that, for all its monotony, was calculated with more care than is often assumed. The navy of this period, increasingly attentive to the link between diet and the health of a crew it could not easily replace at sea. Lemon or lime juice, when it could be had, was issued against scurvy, a disease that had shortened more voyages and killed more sailors across the preceding century than any enemy fleet. Discipline aboard a ship of this size rested heavily on drill, and gun drill above all, since a crew that could load and fire with speed and accuracy was, in the calculus of the age, worth more than any single advantage of size or number the enemy might bring. Sources describing crews of this period suggest that a well-drilled gun crew might manage 3 rounds in the time an average opponent managed 2, a difference that, multiplied across 100 guns and an engagement lasting hours, could decide the outcome of a battle long before either side's admiral fully understood why. The drill was repeated relentlessly, guns run out and hauled back in dumb show, even when no shot was fired. The motions burned into muscle and habit until they required no thought at all, since thought, in the smoke and noise of an actual engagement, was a luxury a gun captain. Not every space aboard her was given over to violence, though nearly all of them existed in the end to serve it. The surgeon's quarters lay low in the ship, near the waterline, chosen for that position precisely because it offered the greatest protection from enemy fire, since it was here, below the level of the guns, that the wounded of a battle would be brought and treated, often by lantern light. The surgeon and his mates, working through what accounts of the period describe with a plainness that says more than any embellishment could. It was grim work, undertaken with the instruments and understanding of its age, and no telling of Victory's life aboard would be honest without acknowledging what waited in reserve behind the ordinary daily calm of drill and mess and watch. At the opposite end of the ship, and in almost every other sense, lay the captain's great cabin, positioned aft beneath the poop deck, its windows looking backward over the ship's wake, the one space aboard that offered anything resembling comfort or privacy. Here, the captain took his meals, often with officers as guests, in surroundings that, while still modest by the standards of a grand house ashore, stood in stark contrast to the crowded gloom of the lower decks. The cabin could be, and in battle was, cleared in minutes, its furniture struck below, its bulkheads removed, so that the space became simply another stretch of open gun deck when the fighting began. A reminder that even the captain's small comforts were provisional, granted only until the ship's true purpose reasserted itself. Victory's role as a flagship added another layer entirely to this already crowded world, since a flagship carried not only her own captain and crew, but an admiral and his staff besides the machinery of fleet command, superimposed over the machinery of the ship herself. Signal flags, run up and down halyards, according to an increasingly sophisticated code developed and refined across these years, allowed an admiral aboard Victory to direct not merely his own vessel but an entire fleet spread across miles of open water, a method of command that demanded clear skies, sharp eyes, and no small amount of trust that the ships receiving the signals would read them correctly and in time. The admiral's presence meant additional officers, additional clerks, additional servants, all finding some corner of the ship to occupy. The great cabin itself, sometimes given over to the admiral rather than the captain, who would then take smaller quarters nearby. The whole delicate business of rank and precedence, worked out and reworked out according to who happened to be aboard. There is something almost startling, viewed from a distance of centuries, in how domestic so much of this life could be, set as it was within a hull built entirely for violence. Men mended clothes, played music, kept small pets, wrote letters home that might wait months for a ship bound the right direction, all of it carried out within a few feet of guns, capable of throwing a 32-pound ball through the hull of an enemy vessel at a range of a few hundred yards. The ship was, in this sense, two things at once: an instrument of war built with total seriousness of purpose, and a small floating society with its own habits, hierarchies, and quiet comforts. The two never fully separable. Since the routines of daily life aboard her existed largely in service of keeping her ready for the moment when the guns would be needed in earnest. For years, this was simply what Victory was: a floating world of 800 men, a wooden town governed by bells and drums, moving from port to blockade and back again, her guns drilled but silent, her surgeon's berth prepared but empty, her signal flags run up for exercises that trained a fleet for a fight that had not yet come. It was calm, in its way, though never idle, a long apprenticeship in readiness. And it was this ship, worked into fighting trim by years of exactly this patient, unglamorous routine, that would carry England's most famous admiral to the one encounter that would define her forever, off a headland on the Spanish coast on a clear October morning that the whole of this long preparation had, without anyone quite intending it. By building steadily toward, the war that shaped these years was not for the most part a war of great fleet actions. It was a war of watching. France, under revolutionary government, and then under the rising figure of Napoleon Bonaparte, commanded an army that could not be matched on land by Britain alone, an army that had marched across the Low Countries and down into Italy and would soon reach into Egypt and beyond. Britain's answer to that army was not another army, for she had none to spare of comparable size, but a fleet and a strategy built entirely upon what that fleet could do. If French soldiers could be kept from ever boarding French ships, if French ports could be watched so closely that no squadron could slip free without being seen, then an invasion of England could be delayed, and delayed again for as long as wood and rope and the endurance of tired crews could hold a line at sea. This was the blockade, and it asked something almost inhuman of the ships that maintained it, for it was not fought in single dramatic mornings, but in years, in months, of standing off a hostile coast in every weather the Atlantic and the Channel could produce, in the slow wearing of hulls and nerves alike. Victory, a first rate of 100 guns, was among the ships built exactly for this kind of endurance, and it was in this kind of service, unglamorous and unrelenting, that she spent the greater part of the 1790s and the years that followed. She served under a succession of admirals in these years, each of whom used her in the manner such a ship demanded, as a flagship, a floating headquarters from which orders passed outward to smaller vessels stationed at intervals along a watching line. She had seen service already under Lord Hood, off Toulon, in the early years of the war against revolutionary France, and had carried his flag through the difficult business of that siege and its aftermath. She had gone on to serve under other commanders as the fighting shifted across the Mediterranean and back toward home waters, her role changing little even as the men who commanded her changed. For a first rate of her size was rare enough that she was rarely left idle for long. Each admiral who took her as his flagship inherited a ship that already understood her own work, crewed by men who had learned the blockade's patient discipline long before any particular commander came aboard. And each admiral in turn added his own habits, his own signals, his own manner of running a fleet, to a hull that absorbed all of it and asked only to be kept sound enough to keep working. It was in the Mediterranean, in the later years of this long contest, that Victory's fortunes became bound most closely to a single name. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson had already, by the turn of the century, made himself known as a commander of unusual daring, a man who at the Battle of the Nile had destroyed a French fleet at anchor, and who carried from wounds taken in earlier actions the visible marks of a career built on being close to danger rather than distant from it. He had commanded from other flagships before Victory came fully into his service, and his reputation and the fierce loyalty he drew from officers and men alike had grown steadily across those earlier campaigns. When Nelson came aboard Victory as Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean in the year 1803, it began a partnership between man and ship that would in time come to define how both were remembered. The bond was not sentimental in any way the historical record allows us to romanticize without care, for Nelson worked his flagship as he worked every asset under his command, hard and without indulgence. But something did settle between them across these campaigns, a familiarity that comes only from years, from a ship that had already logged decades of hard service, coming to know the particular rhythms of one particular commander, his habit of walking a certain stretch of the quarterdeck, his insistence on speed in signals, his unusual closeness with his captains, whom he gathered for dinner and discussion in a manner that some found unorthodox, and that his men, by most surviving accounts, found inspiring. For 2 years through 1803 and into 1804 and 5, Nelson kept his fleet on station off Toulon, watching the French squadron sheltered there under Admiral Villeneuve, in a blockade so prolonged and so thoroughly maintained that it became, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable feats of endurance in the whole war. Victory stood off that coast through storms that scattered lesser ships and through calms that made the waiting feel endless, and Nelson's fleet, unlike many of its predecessors in earlier wars, kept close enough and supplied itself well enough that it did not need to retreat to harbor. A discipline of logistics, as much as seamanship, that historians have since credited with keeping the pressure on the French fleet nearly unbroken. When Villeneuve's squadron did finally slip out, in the spring of 1805, evading the blockade during a period of bad weather and scattered British ships, it set off a long chase across the Atlantic. Nelson pursuing the combined French and Spanish forces to the West Indies and back again. A pursuit that covered thousands of miles, and that ended for the moment without the general engagement Nelson wanted, the enemy fleet slipping into the Spanish port of Cadiz, rather than accepting battle. It was there, off Cadiz, through the late summer and into the autumn of 1805, that the final gathering took place. Villeneuve's combined fleet, French and Spanish ships together numbering some 33 ships of the line, lay in harbour, watched from beyond the horizon by Nelson's blockading squadron. Itself built around a core of some 27 ships, Victory among them. Her decks once more, the centre from which orders and signals radiated outward to captains who had, by this stage of the war, learned to read Nelson's intentions almost before the flags were fully run up. The weeks of that autumn were quiet in the way that only a long-anticipated event can make a season quiet, full of watching and waiting and the constant low work of keeping ships fit for action that might come at any hour or might, as it so often had before. Frigates kept close inshore to watch the harbour mouth, relaying what they saw back to the main fleet standing further out. And Nelson himself, according to the accounts of officers who served near him in those weeks, spent long hours in conversation with his captains, laying out in advance the manner in which he intended to fight if battle came. Plan that departed from the rigid line of battle tactics of earlier generations, and asked instead for a bolder, more concentrated attack, cutting the enemy line rather than matching it ship for ship along its length. Whether this plan would be needed at all remained, through most of October, an open question, for Villeneuve showed no immediate inclination to leave the shelter of Cadiz, and there were days when it seemed the whole vast assembly of ships on both sides might simply continue this long-wearing vigil into the winter. But orders had reached Villeneuve from Napoleon himself. Dissatisfaction with the fleet's inaction, and by the third week of October, word came to Nelson's ships that the combined fleet was preparing to move, provisioning, taking on stores, showing the small signs by which a blockading squadron learns that its quarry intends at last to run. The weather in those final days was watched as closely as the enemy, for the fate of any fleet action depended as much on wind and sea state as on any admiral's tactics, and the logs of British ships in this period record the careful, almost ritual attention paid to cloud and swell, to the direction from which the breeze was blowing and how it might shift by morning. On the 19th and 20th of October, the combined fleet began at last to come out of harbour, and Nelson's ships, which had spent so long standing off at a distance calculated to remain unseen from the coast while still catching every signal from the inshore frigates, began now to draw closer, positioning themselves between the enemy and the open Atlantic, between Cadiz and whatever destination Villeneuve intended, whether the Mediterranean or some more distant theatre of the war. There was, in the way survivors of those days later described it, a stillness to the gathering that felt almost unnatural, given what everyone aboard understood was coming. A fleet moving into position with the unhurried, practiced calm of men who had rehearsed this moment for years without ever quite being certain it would arrive. Victory's own crew, by every account that survives, went about the last preparations with the same steadiness that had carried them through 2 years of blockade clearing, for action, stowing what could be stowed, and waiting as the sun rose on the 21st of October for the order that would send them, at last, into the battle the whole long watch had been building toward. The morning of the 21st of October, 1805, broke over the waters off Cape Trafalgar with a light swell and a wind so faint that the great ships, for all their size, seemed to creep rather than sail toward one another. Nelson had chosen in the days before a method of attack that departed from the long tradition of naval warfare, in which fleets arranged themselves in parallel lines and exchanged broadsides at a distance until one side or the other broke. He intended instead to sail directly at the combined French and Spanish fleet in 2 columns, cutting through their line rather than running alongside it, accepting a period of exposure to enemy fire in exchange for bringing on a general and decisive action rather than a cautious and indecisive one. It was a plan that placed enormous risk on the ships at the head of each column, for they would receive the fire of many enemy vessels before they could bring their own guns to bear in return. Victory led the weather column. She would be among the first to feel what the plan cost. As the two fleets closed, the combined force of French and Spanish ships stretched across the horizon in a long curving line, some 33 ships of the line standing in loose formation under the command of the French Admiral Villeneuve, with Spanish ships interspersed among them under Admiral Gravina. Nelson, aboard Victory, walked her decks in the hours before contact with what those present described as a settled, almost cheerful composure, a man who had waited 2 years for this, and now found it arriving at last. Quote, "It was in these hours that he composed and sent the signal that would become, in time, the most quoted sentence in British naval history. Using the flag code devised by Sir Home Popham, Victory ran up the message, letter by letter, hoisted so that the whole fleet might read it as it passed down the line. England expects that every man will do his duty." The wording, by Nelson's own account, had originally begun with "England confides," but the signal officers suggested "expects" as a word already present in the code book, sparing time in the hoisting, and Nelson accepted the change without complaint. The sailors, who watched it climb the halyards, according to the accounts that survive, received it with a low cheer, not the roar of drama, but the quiet acknowledgement of men who understood exactly what was being asked of them, and were in the main prepared to give it. Victory continued her approach in near silence, for what must have felt, to those aboard her, like an unbearable length of time. The wind was so light that her progress toward the enemy line was slow, and for the better part of an hour she absorbed fire from ship after ship in the combined fleet without being able to answer in kind, her guns unable to bear until she had drawn close enough to break through the line herself. Shot tore through her rigging and her hull during this approach, and men fell on her decks before she had fired a single gun of her own in reply. It was, by every account, a testing of nerve unlike almost anything else in the age of sail, an ordeal to be endured rather than fought, and Victory endured it, her helm holding steady, her crew standing to their stations under fire they could not yet return. She broke through the enemy line just after noon, passing close under the stern of the French flagship Bucentaure, and as she passed, she fired a raking broadside directly through Bucentaure's stern windows and the length of her decks. A single devastating discharge that accounts describe as clearing much of the ship's gun crews and disabling a large portion of her armament in one stroke. It was the kind of blow that, in the close and brutal mathematics of ship-to-ship combat under sail, could decide an engagement in a matter of minutes, and it left Bucentaure crippled even as the wider battle continued to unfold around her. Victory herself did not escape what followed. She became entangled in the press of the action with the French ship Redoutable, the two vessels grinding against one another at close quarters, so close that men on each ship's deck could see the faces of those they fought. It was aboard Redoutable that marksmen had been stationed in the fighting tops, riflemen positioned above the deck with orders to pick off officers on the enemy ship below, a tactic that some captains considered ungentlemanly and others considered simply practical in a battle without quarter. It was from one of these positions, at around 1:15 in the afternoon, that a musket ball struck Nelson as he walked the quarterdeck with his flag captain Thomas Hardy. The ball entered through his left shoulder, passed through a lung, and lodged near his spine, a wound that those who examined him almost immediately understood to be mortal. Nelson himself, by Hardy's account, recognized as much, at once saying that they had done for him at last and that his backbone was shot through. He was carried below to the cockpit, the dim, low-ceilinged space where the ship's surgeon tended the wounded during action, and there he was laid among the other injured men of the crew, refusing, in the accounts that survive, to be given precedence over them despite his rank, insisting, instead, on waiting his turn as the surgeon worked his way through those brought down before him. The battle continued above him for hours, the sound of it reaching down into the cockpit as gunfire and the groan of timber and the cries of men. A battle he could hear but no longer see, receiving reports carried down to him by officers as the action developed. He was told as the afternoon wore on that a number of enemy ships had struck their colors, that the combined fleet was breaking apart under the weight of the attack, that the day, in the terms that mattered most to him, was being won. He is recorded as having said, on hearing this, that he was glad and pressed for confirmation that no ship of his own had surrendered, wanting assurance that the victory was as complete as it appeared to be. Hardy came below more than once to sit with him, and it was to Hardy that Nelson is said to have spoken some of the final words later remembered, expressions of concern for his own reputation and his affairs, and a request often repeated in the retelling since that Hardy kiss him, which Hardy did first on the cheek and then, at Nelson's further request. Upon the forehead, Nelson died in the cockpit of Victory a little after 4 in the afternoon, some 3 hours after he had been struck, by which time the battle above him had turned decisively in Britain's favour. The combined French and Spanish fleet lost 18 ships of the line captured or destroyed, without the loss of a single British vessel, a result so lopsided that it ended, for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, any serious challenge to British naval supremacy at sea. It was, by any measure available to naval history, one of the most complete victories ever achieved by a fleet against another fleet of comparable size, and it secured, in the years that followed, the safety of Britain's shores against invasion and the freedom of her trade routes across the world. And yet the victory came bound inseparably to the loss, so that the two could not be spoken of apart from one another in the years that followed, nor can they be now. Victory's crew had won the battle their commander had spent 2 years preparing them for, had broken the combined fleet as thoroughly as any fleet has been broken in the age of sail, and had done so while their admiral lay dying below their feet, unable to see the outcome he had shaped from the moment he first ran the signal up the halyards that morning. There is a particular quiet that surrounds this kind of victory, a triumph achieved at the exact moment its architect is taken from it, and those aboard Victory carried that quiet home with them, the ship herself bearing in the weeks that followed both the marks of the battle she had won, sailing back toward England not simply as a victorious flagship, but as something closer to a floating tomb, carrying Nelson's body preserved in a cask of spirits below decks, toward a homecoming that would be in its own way as solemn as the battle itself had been triumphant. The ship that came away from Trafalgar bore little resemblance to the vessel that had sailed into it. Her masts were shattered above the fighting tops, her rigging cut through in 100 places and knotted back together with whatever rope and skill could be found, her sails patched and repatched until they held more mend than original canvas. Below the waterline, the carpenters had been at work through the battle and long after it, plugging shot holes with wooden plugs and canvas and tallow, watching the pumps day and night to keep the sea where it belonged. Victory had taken more than 100 hits to her hull and structure, her wheel destroyed, her mizzenmast gone entirely, and for a time after the battle she lay virtually helpless, taken in tow by another ship because she could not reliably make her own way through the water. The storm that followed the battle, the one that scattered so many of the prizes taken that day and drove some of them onto the rocks of the Spanish coast, tested a fleet already broken by combat, and Victory herself rode through it in a condition that would have seemed impossible to any shipwright asked before the battle, whether such a hull could survive such treatment and still float. But she did float, and she did make her way, slowly, under jury rig and tow, back toward Gibraltar for the first stage of her repairs, and from there, in time, toward England, carrying in her hold a cargo far heavier than any she had carried before. Below decks, in a cask filled with brandy and later spirits of wine, Nelson's body made the journey home. The choice to preserve him this way, common enough in naval practice for officers who died at sea and needed to be brought back for burial rather than committed to the water, took on here a weight beyond the merely practical. For the man in the cask was not simply an officer whose family wished him returned, but the architect of the greatest naval victory of the age, and the ship carrying him was the very vessel from which he had commanded that victory and on whose deck he had fallen. The crew who kept watch over that cask through the long weeks of the voyage home did so with an attentiveness that went beyond duty, changing the spirits when needed, watching for any sign that the preservation was failing, aware that they carried something the entire nation would want returned to it whole. Sailors who had fought the battle now found themselves custodians of its aftermath, and the mood aboard, according to what accounts survive, was one of a strange doubled feeling, pride, in what had been accomplished sitting alongside a grief that had nowhere yet to be properly expressed, since grief requires a rival, requires a place and a ceremony. And victory was still weeks from either. When she did arrive, first at Spithead and then making her way into Portsmouth, the reception was unlike anything the ship had known, even in her most celebrated moments before the battle. Word of Trafalgar had already reached England ahead of her, carried by faster vessels, so that the country had already begun its strange work of celebrating a victory while mourning its cost. And victory's arrival gave that mixed public feeling a physical object to gather around. Crowds came to the harbour not merely to see a ship that had fought greatly, though that alone would have drawn them, but to stand near the vessel that held, however briefly still, the body of the man they had already begun to memorialize before he had even properly come ashore. The ship herself battered and patched, her masts still showing the damage of the battle and the storm that followed, became for those crowds a kind of relic. Even before the body was removed from her, a witness that could be looked upon, that had been present at the exact moment history turned. The removal of Nelson's body from Victory and its journey from Portsmouth to London unfolded as a procession of a scale rarely seen for any figure who was not royalty. The body was transferred, eventually, into a coffin, itself carrying its own history, having been made in part from the mast of a French ship, and the journey from the coast to the capital was marked by crowds gathering at each stage, by church bells, by a hush that fell over towns as the procession passed through them. In London, the lying-in state drew such numbers that the arrangements strained to accommodate them. Ordinary people standing in long lines for the chance to pass near the coffin of a man most of them had never met and never would have, whose face they knew only from prints and paintings, but whose victory they had claimed as their own collective relief after years of fearing invasion, fearing a France under Napoleon that seemed, before Trafalgar, capable of anything. The funeral itself, held at St. Paul's Cathedral, was staged with a grandeur usually reserved for monarchs, the procession through London streets stretching for a great distance, sailors from Victory herself among those who marched, carrying with them the shot-torn ensign that had flown from the ship during the battle. An object that the crowds recognized immediately for what it represented, even without explanation. The ceremony inside the cathedral, the placing of the coffin in the crypt, the honors read aloud, all of it constructed a moment of national mourning that fused in the public imagination forever afterward with the victory that had produced it. England had won the battle that all but ended the immediate threat of invasion, had broken the naval power that Napoleon depended upon, and had, in the same stroke, lost the man who had done more than any other to secure that victory. And the nation's response was to mourn and celebrate in the same breath, unable and unwilling to separate the two. Victory herself, in all of this, underwent a transformation that no repair yard could have effected, however skilled. She had been before Trafalgar, a distinguished ship, a veteran of earlier campaigns, a vessel respected within the Navy and known to some degree by the public who followed such things. After Trafalgar, after carrying Nelson's body home, after becoming the object that crowds gathered to see at Portsmouth before the coffin was ever brought ashore, she became something else entirely, a symbol that existed independent of her continuing usefulness as a warship. A vessel whose identity was now inseparable from that single voyage and the man she had carried alive and then dead across the same stretch of ocean. Ships of her class were built to fight, refitted, repaired, eventually broken up when they had given what service they could give, and Victory might well have followed that same path, an admirable but ultimately unremarkable end for a ship that had done her duty. Instead, the voyage home from Trafalgar fixed her in the national memory in a way that no ordinary service record could have done, so that even as she continued, in the years that followed, to serve in more modest capacities, she carried with her always the weight of that particular autumn, the battle and the storm and the long, slow passage home, with her most famous passenger lying preserved below her decks. It is worth pausing over how strange this transformation truly was, for the ship had done nothing at Trafalgar that other ships of the line did not also do, had fought bravely but not uniquely, had suffered damage severe but not unparalleled among the fleet. What set her apart, what fixed her in memory above her sister ships, was simply the accident of having been the flagship, of having had Nelson aboard when he fell, of being the vessel chosen to carry him home rather than any other. History is often made this way, not through some inherent superiority in the object remembered, but through proximity to a moment too large to be forgotten. And Victory's proximity to Nelson's death made her, forever afterward, something more than a ship. In the years that followed the funeral, Victory returned gradually to more ordinary duties, her masts repaired, her hull made sound again, her role in the Navy continuing, even as her legend had already, in some sense, been completed. She would serve on through further decades, would carry other flags and see other waters, would grow old the way ships grow old, through slow accumulation of repair and refit and changing purpose, but she would never again be simply a ship among ships. The voyage home from Trafalgar had already written her into a story larger than her own continuing service, and everything that came after, the quieter years, the diminishing role, the eventual uncertainty over her fate, would unfold in the shadow of that one autumn when she carried victory and grief across the same water, inseparable. Toward a homecoming the entire nation had been waiting for, without quite knowing what shape its waiting would take. And yet the ship's story did not end where the nation's mourning did. Nelson was carried ashore at Greenwich, and the crowds that had lined the riverbanks to watch his coffin pass slowly returned to their ordinary lives, and Victory herself still afloat, still rigged, still manned by officers and crews who had known nothing else, sailed on into a service that would prove far longer and far stranger than anyone standing at the water's edge that December could have imagined. She was repaired at Chatham through the early months of the following year, her timbers examined by shipwrights who had followed her career from a distance and now had the chance to see, plank by plank, what Trafalgar had cost her. The damage was extensive, but not, in the end, beyond the ordinary competence of the yard. To mend, masts were replaced. Sections of hull scarred by shot were cut away and made good with new timber, fitted with the same patient joinery that had built her 30 years before. By the summer, she was fit for sea again, and the Admiralty, which had no shortage of uses for a ship of her class, returned her to active duty, as though the battle that had made her famous was simply one more entry in a service record already crowded with entries. She sailed again in the years that followed, though never again into an engagement that would rival what she had already done. There was blockade duty off the French coast, the slow, patient work of watching harbours and denying an enemy the use of the sea, work that asked nothing dramatic of a ship, but everything of her crew's endurance. There was a period in the Baltic where the political currents of the Napoleonic Wars carried the Royal Navy into waters far colder than the Mediterranean she had known under Nelson, and where Victory served as a flagship once more. Carrying an admiral's flag into a theatre of the war that history would remember far less vividly than Trafalgar, but that mattered at the time, just as urgently to the men who sailed it. She was, by this point in her career, an old ship by the standards of her age, and yet she showed no particular inclination to be finished. The wars against France dragged on. Napoleon's fortunes rose and fell, and rose again, and through it all, Victory continued to be useful in the unglamorous way that a proven ship remains useful long after the moment of her greatest fame. The end of the wars, when it came in 1815, did not end her service so much as change its character entirely. A navy built for a generation of continuous warfare found itself, in peacetime, possessed of far more ships than it needed, and far more first-rates in particular than any conceivable future conflict seemed to require. Ships were paid off in numbers, their crews dispersed, their guns removed, their masts sometimes taken down entirely as they were reduced to hulks for one purpose or another. It would have been an unremarkable fate for Victory to share, and for a time it seemed she might. But her reputation, by now fixed permanently in the national memory as the ship that had carried Nelson to his final victory and then carried his body home, made her something more than an ordinary surplus vessel to be quietly disposed of. The Admiralty, whatever its practical calculations about the cost of maintaining an aging first rate, seems to have understood from early on that Victory could not simply be broken up and sold for her timber the way lesser ships were. She was moved instead to Portsmouth, into the harbour that had watched her launch more than 50 years before, and there she began the long second life that would occupy her for the remainder of the century and beyond. No longer a ship of the line in the sense that had made her famous, but a harbour ship moored in place, serving in roles that asked nothing of her sailing qualities and everything of her continued physical presence. She became, in this new phase, the flagship of the Portsmouth Command, a title that carried real administrative weight, even as it removed her permanently from the sea. An admiral's flag flew from her masts, signifying that Portsmouth, as a naval station, had its headquarters aboard her decks even though she no longer moved from her moorings, except when towed for maintenance or repositioning. Officers conducted business aboard her. Ceremonies were held on her deck, the sort of formal occasions where a navy wished to mark an event with the gravity that only a historic ship could provide. She hosted visiting dignitaries who wished to walk the deck when Nelson had fallen, and in this she became something the Navy had perhaps not entirely planned for. Not simply a functioning administrative vessel, but a monument that happened to still be capable of floating, a piece of living history that the public increasingly wished to see for themselves. This dual identity, part working harbour ship and part shrine, shaped the decades that followed in ways that left a complicated mark on her physical fabric. She was repaired, again and again, sometimes for practical reasons of seaworthiness, and sometimes simply to keep her presentable for the visitors and officials who came aboard. Each repair meant timber removed and timber replaced, and across the decades this slow accumulation of alteration transformed the question of what exactly remained of the ship that had fought at Trafalgar into one of the more persistent debates in naval history. Shipwrights of the 1820s were not thinking of future historians when they replaced a rotted plank or a sprung timber. They were thinking only of keeping the ship sound enough to serve her present purpose whatever that happened to be in a given decade. The result, over 100 years and more of this ongoing maintenance, was a vessel that by any strict accounting contained a great deal of timber that postdated Trafalgar by decades, layered in among sections that genuinely reached back to her original construction and even, in places, to timber salvage from other ships and fitted into her during repairs. A common practice of the age that makes the question of her original fabric more tangled still. Historians and shipwrights alike have argued, in the years since, over how much of the Victory that exists is truly the Victory that fought Napoleon's fleet, and the honest answer, arrived at without much satisfaction on either side of the debate, is that no one can say with precision. Ships of this era were not preserved the way a modern institution might preserve an artifact. Sealed against change and protected from the elements, they were kept alive through continuous intervention, patched and mended and rebuilt in a slow-rolling process that left no clear boundary between the original ship. Some proportion of her original oak, estimates vary, and none claim certainty, survives within her frame even now, buried beneath layers of later repair. And the rest is the accumulated work of generations of shipwrights who never intended to be erasing history so much as simply keeping a ship afloat. What makes Victory's situation across these decades so strange, in the end, is not the repairs themselves, which were ordinary enough for any long-lived wooden vessel, but the peculiar drawn-out nature of her retirement. She was never scrapped, as so many of her contemporaries were, broken up for timber once their fighting days ended and their maintenance costs outweighed their usefulness. She was never lost at sea, as so many ships of her generation eventually were, wrecked on a lee shore or foundered in a storm far from any harbor that might have saved her. She simply aged in place, decade after decade, moored in the same waters, watched over by a navy that could never quite bring itself to let her go, and yet never quite committed the resources to fully arrest her slow decline either. The century turned around her. Sail gave way to steam, wood gave way to iron, and then to steel, and the entire world of naval warfare that had produced her transformed itself into something she would scarcely have recognized, and through all of it she remained where she was, flying an admiral's flag, receiving visitors, growing slowly and unmistakably older beneath the weight of paint and patched timber and the accumulated moisture of a harbor that never stopped working at her hull. It was a fate gentler than destruction and less dignified than a hero's ending, a long twilight rather than a sudden dusk. And it could not, as the years wore on and her timbers grew more tired and her hull more strained by the accumulated burden of her own weight, continue indefinitely, without some reckoning arriving to determine whether the ship that had outlived Trafalgar could outlive her own slow decay as well. The reckoning came slowly, as most things did with Victory, and by the early years of the 20th century, it had become difficult for anyone who looked closely at her to pretend otherwise. She had by then spent more than a century afloat, moored in the waters off Portsmouth, and the sea that had never quite left her had continued its patient work upon her hull long after the guns had gone silent and the decks had emptied of anything resembling a fighting crew. Water is patient, in a way that battle is not. A cannonball either strikes or it does not, and the moment of danger passes, but the slow intrusion of damp into timber, the gradual softening of wood that has stood too long in salt air and standing water, works without any single moment of crisis, and so it is easy to overlook until the damage has already gone deep. By the time official attention turned fully upon her condition, the rot had gone deep indeed. Surveys conducted in the years following the turn of the century found decay in her lower timbers that no amount of surface paint could disguise, frames weakened to the point of real concern, and a hull that had begun, in places, to work loose from itself under the strain of simply floating. She had survived the massed broadsides of the Franco-Spanish fleet, with less structural harm than she now carried from 100 years of tides. The neglect that compounded this decay was not born of malice. No one in the Admiralty woke each morning wishing harm upon the ship that had carried Nelson to his death and his victory in the same afternoon, but a navy modernizing at extraordinary speed, building ships of steel and steam that made wooden hulls seem almost quaint, had limited attention and limited funds to spare for the maintenance of a vessel whose active service had ended so long before. TOC competed in practice against ironclads and dreadnoughts for a share of resources that inevitably went to the ships still expected to fight. She remained a receiving ship, then a base of sorts, useful in low administrative ways that had nothing to do with the reasons anyone remembered her name. And in that reduced role, she received the reduced care that came with it. Paint went on when paint was needed to keep up appearances, rather than when the underlying timber demanded structural attention. Repairs were made piecemeal, addressing the visible rather than the deep, in the manner of a house patched at the roof while the foundation continued to settle unseen. It was neglect of the ordinary bureaucratic kind, the kind that arises not from any decision to let a thing fail, but from the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller decisions to attend to something else first, and it is often more dangerous than active harm precisely because no one intends it, and so no one feels the urgency to stop it. Then, in the early days of the year 1903, came an injury of the sort no amount of careful maintenance could have prevented, and one bitterly reminiscent of the dangers she had always faced upon open water, even while she now sat at anchor in a harbour meant to protect her. Battleship, the Neptune under tow and driven by a strong wind, collided with Victory's stern, and the impact was severe enough that for a time it seemed she might actually go down at her moorings. The great ship that had never sunk under fire, brought suddenly and absurdly close to sinking under an accident of towing in her own home port. She did not sink. But the collision drove home, in a manner that no survey report alone could have achieved, just how fragile her condition had become, and how thin the margin now was between the monument that people believed indestructible and the old, tired, waterlogged hull that in fact bore her weight. The ship that had absorbed the fire of an enemy fleet without foundering had very nearly gone down at her own dock, struck by a friendly vessel in an accident of wind and tide. And the irony of this was not lost on those who began in the years that followed to ask harder questions about what exactly was being done to preserve her. It was in this atmosphere of growing alarm that public and institutional attention began gradually to organize itself into something like a rescue. The Society for Nautical Research, formed in the years before the First World War by a group of historians, naval officers, and interested citizens who shared a conviction that Britain's maritime heritage deserved active protection rather than passive sentiment, took up Victory's cause as one of its earliest and most urgent projects. The Society's founders understood something that the ordinary machinery of naval administration had been slow to grasp, that a ship as bound up with national identity as Victory could not simply be allowed to rot away through inattention, however gradual and however unintentional, without it eventually becoming a matter of public shame rather than private neglect. They began to campaign, publishing appeals, lobbying figures within the Admiralty and in Parliament, and working to draw public sympathy toward a ship that most people had assumed, in the vague way that national monuments are often assumed to be safe simply because they are famous. The war intervened, as it intervened in nearly everything during those years, delaying serious action while the nation's attention and resources turned to matters of immediate survival. But it also, in an odd way, sharpened the eventual resolve to act. For a country that had just endured 4 years of loss, found itself newly attentive to the value of what endured from earlier and equally costly victories. By the early 1920s, the campaign had gathered enough momentum, enough public sympathy, and enough support within the Admiralty itself to produce a decision that would settle, at last, the question of Victory's fate. She would not be broken up. She would not be left afloat to continue her slow disintegration in the waters that had done more to harm her in a century than the French and Spanish guns had managed in a single afternoon. Instead, she would be moved into permanent dry dock at Portsmouth, lifted finally and completely out of the water that had both preserved and threatened her in equal measure across more than 100 years, and placed upon a foundation of blocks and cradles built to bear her weight without the constant erosive pressure of tide and damp. In 1922, the move was made. She was drawn into to dock at Portsmouth, the same yard, in a sense that had first launched her into the water nearly 160 years before, and there she was, settled into a berth from which she has never since departed. The dry dock did not merely repair her condition, it changed the fundamental nature of her existence. For the whole of her active life, and for the long decades of her afterlife as a harbour ship, she had been defined by her relationship to water, a vessel built to float, to be moved by wind and tide, to answer the sea in the manner all ships must. Now she rested on dry land, supported by timber and iron rather than buoyed by water. No longer a ship in the working sense of the word, but something else, something new to her long history. A monument, fixed in place, meant to be visited rather than sailed. There is a particular gentleness to reflecting on how near a thing came to being lost, not through violence, but through the simple accumulation of years and inattention. Victory had weathered the massed fire of an enemy fleet at the height of her fame and suffered damage that, however severe, never once threatened her existence as a ship. It was, instead, the slow and undramatic passage of ordinary time, compounded by shortages of funding and attention rather than by any single catastrophic event, that brought her nearest to true destruction. The hero's death that never came to her in battle nearly came to her instead in the quiet erosion of a harbour mooring, and it is a fact worth sitting with that the ship who outlived Trafalgar so completely, who carried her admiral home in triumph and grief together, so nearly succumbed instead to rot and the plain arithmetic of naval budgets. It is not a heroic story in the way that Trafalgar was heroic, but it is, in its own quieter fashion, no less consequential. For without the Society for Nautical Research and without the decision to lift her finally from the water, there would be no ship left today for anyone to visit, no timbers left to study, no deck left to stand upon and imagine the sound of the guns. What began in 1922 as an act of rescue would, in time, become the foundation for something more deliberate still, an era of sustained restoration and careful historical study in which each plank and fitting would be examined, questioned, and when necessary replaced in the long, patient work of keeping her whole. Since that year in dry dock, the work has never truly stopped. What began as an emergency, a race against rot, and the slow collapse of a hull no longer supported by the sea, became instead a permanent condition of her existence, a kind of continuous tending that has now outlasted the lifetimes of everyone who first proposed it. Shipwrights trained in the old methods, and some trained specifically for her, have spent decades moving quietly through her frames, testing the oak with mallets and probes, listening for the dull sound that means decay has taken hold beneath a sound-looking surface. Where the wood answers true, it is left. Where it does not, it is cut away, and a new piece is shaped and fitted in its place, following the lines of the old as closely as the records and the surviving timber allow. This has been the pattern of her care for the better part of a century, not a single restoration, but an unending sequence of small ones, each addressing some fresh failure in a structure that time and salt and fungus have never stopped working to unmake. The extent of this replacement has become, over the years, a subject of real scholarly attention, and not without some discomfort. Estimates of how much of her original fabric remains have varied and have shifted as further work has been done. But there is general agreement that a substantial portion of the timber now in her hull was not part of the ship that fought at Trafalgar, nor even part of the ship as she stood in the early 20th century when she was first lifted from the water. Some of her keel is thought to survive from her earliest construction, and certain of her frames and knees deep within the structure are believed to date to the 1760s. But much of the outer hull, the decks, the masts, and a great deal of the rigging and fittings have been replaced one or more times since in wood matched as closely as possible to the original, but cut from trees felled centuries after the ones that first built her. The ship visitors walk through today is, by any strict accounting, a composite. Old and new oak fitted together across gaps of 200 years, held to a single form by drawings, by memory, and by the discipline of those who have maintained her. This has drawn the attention of naval historians and archaeologists in a way that few museum ships have experienced, precisely because her survival has been so long and so thoroughly documented. Successive generations of researchers have gone through her structure, timber by timber, cross-referencing surviving fragments against dockyard records, against the original drafts held in national archives, against paintings and models made in her working life, in an effort to establish with some precision what she once was and what she has since become. Her armament has been studied in comparable detail, gun by gun, carriage by carriage, as scholars have worked to determine which pieces reflect her fitting at Trafalgar and which were added, removed, or altered during the decades of service that followed, or during the long series of refits undertaken once she had ceased to go to sea. Her rigging has been reconstructed according to period practice where the evidence allows, though even here debate persists over details of run and proportion, since the written and pictorial record, however extensive, was never intended to serve as a plan for later reconstruction and leaves gaps that specialists still argue over today. This scholarly attention has not diminished with time, as might have been expected of a ship so long studied. If anything, it has intensified, aided by methods unavailable to her earlier custodians, dendrochronology, which allows the felling dates of individual timbers to be established with some confidence by reading the pattern of their growth rings, imaging techniques that can reveal decay and repair hidden beneath layers of paint and later fitting, and a far more systematic approach to archival research than existed in the earlier decades of her preservation, when much restoration proceeded on the best judgment of shipwrights working from incomplete records. The picture that has emerged from all of this is not a simple one. It is a picture of a ship altered continuously across 2 centuries, first by the routine demands of active service, then by the more deliberate hand of restoration, so that no single moment in her long history can be pointed to as the definitive form of the vessel. She has been, in a sense, always under construction, from the felling of the first oaks at Chatham to the present day. She remains now what she has been for the better part of a century, a museum ship, held in permanent dry dock, open to the public, and maintained as far as possible by the traditional methods of her original construction, though modern conservation science now guides many of the decisions once left to instinct and experience alone. She is visited by many thousands each year, who walk her decks and descend into the spaces where her crew once lived and worked, and who are told, in careful and honest terms, something of what she is and something of what she has become. She retains a ceremonial role as well, remaining formally in commission, the flagship of a shore command, still crewed in a symbolic sense by serving personnel of the Navy she was built to serve. In this, she occupies an unusual position among the great ships that survive from her era, not simply a relic set behind glass, but an object still maintained, still tended, still understood by those responsible for her as a living structure with ongoing needs rather than a finished artifact whose story has closed. This condition has given rise, naturally enough, to a question that shipwrights and historians have turned over for as long as sustained restoration has been underway. Whether a vessel rebuilt so many times, in wood, not of her original fabric, joined and fitted across centuries by hands unknown to one another, remains in any meaningful sense the same ship that fought at Trafalgar. It is not a question with a settled answer, and those who have thought hardest about her tend not to offer one. Some point to the survival of her lines, her form, her name, and the continuous thread of use and care that connects the vessel in dry dock today to the one that carried Nelson's flag, and argue that identity of this kind rests not in the persistence of particular planks, but in the persistence of pattern. Others note, more cautiously, that a ship is in the end a physical object, and that an object whose material has been substantially replaced is, whatever else may be said of it, no longer entirely the object it once was, however faithfully the replacement has been carried out. Both positions have their defenders among those who have studied her closely, and the debate itself has become, in its way, part of her history, discussed in journals and dockside lectures, much as her battles once were discussed in the newspapers of her own time. What can be said without dispute is that she has been kept from vanishing, and that this has required an extraordinary patient labor sustained by generations of shipwrights, historians, and conservators who will mostly go unnamed in the accounts that future visitors read, but whose work is nonetheless present in every sound timber beneath the paint. There is something in this that resembles the slower processes by which memory itself is kept alive across generations, refreshed and partially rewritten, with each retelling never quite identical to what came before, yet still recognizably the same story carried forward by those willing to do the quiet work. She stands now neither wholly original nor wholly new, but something else. A structure sustained by continuous attention against the certainty of decay, in which the question of what precisely remains from 1765 matters perhaps less than the fact that something remains at all. Still afloat in dry dock, still tended, still visited, still telling in wood and iron a story that would otherwise have been left only to paper and memory. She rests today in Portsmouth, in a dry dock built to hold her weight without the sea's assistance. And if a visitor comes early enough, before the crowds arrive and the guides begin their rounds, there is a stillness around her that feels older than the naval base surrounding it, older than the steel warships moored not far off, older even than the harbour itself. The light falls across her decks the way it must have fallen on countless ordinary mornings in 1790, in 1805, in 1820, mornings that meant nothing in particular to the men who lived them, and everything in retrospect to those who study them now. Her hull is black and ochre, banded in the old pattern that once let a captain's ship be known at a glance across a bay full of similar vessels, and her masts rise into the sky at Portsmouth with the same improbable height they always had, though the wood in them, and indeed in most of her, is not the wood that first went up in 1759 when the great oaks of southern England were felled to give her shape. She is, and has been for a long time, a vessel maintained, rather than a vessel merely preserved, which is a distinction worth sitting with, because it changes what it means to stand before her. Her singular place in this story is not something she earned by surviving unchanged. It is something she earned by surviving at all, in whatever form that survival required. Every other first rate that shared her world is gone. The French and Spanish ships that faced her at Trafalgar were burned, wrecked, or broken up long ago, their timbers scattered to bonfires and shipyards, and the seabed off a Spanish cape remembered only in logs and paintings and the occasional recovered fitting in a museum case. Her sister ships in the Royal Navy, the other 100-gun Leviathans built in the same decades to the same essential design, were broken up for scrap or allowed to rot at their moorings. Once steam and iron made their kind obsolete, their oak sold for furniture or firewood, their guns melted or given away, their names surviving only in naval records and the occasional street sign in a dockyard town. She alone was kept, not because anyone in 1765 could have imagined the century that followed, but because in each successive generation, someone decided the effort of keeping her was worth making. And that decision, repeated often enough across enough decades, is itself a kind of monument, quieter than the ship, but no less real. It is worth pausing on what that means, because it is easy standing before her to imagine that she survived through some inherent property of the wood itself, some special hardness in the oak of the Wealden forests that made her different from every other hull cut from the same stock. But the oak was not different. Ships built alongside her, from timber gathered in the same counties by the same methods, did not last. What lasted was attention. What lasted was the decision made over and over by administrations and dockyard officers, and eventually by charitable trusts and volunteer shipwrights, that this particular hull deserved the labor of replacement and repair that every other hull of her era was denied. She became, without anyone quite intending it at the start, an experiment in what continuous care can do against the plain fact that timber rots, iron rusts, and nothing built by human hands resists time indefinitely without help. She is proof that endurance at the scale of centuries is rarely a property of materials. It is a property of will, renewed generation after generation by people who mostly never met each other and who worked in their own years without knowing whether the effort would be continued after them. There is something instructive in that for the larger story of ambition this chronicle has followed from its opening pages. The story of a kingdom that needed a floating fortress large enough to declare its intentions to rivals across the channel. And of the forests felled, and the years spent in timber, and the launching that nearly failed, and the decades of waiting before she found her war ambition built her. But ambition alone does not explain why she still exists. Ambition explains the first keel laying, the assembly of 6,000 trees, the 7 years of labor in the Chatham yard. Does not explain the choice made in 1822, and again in the 1890s, and again in the 1920s, and again in every decade since, to spend money and skill on a vessel that had long ceased to have any military purpose at all. That second kind of commitment, quieter and less glamorous than the building of a great warship, is the one that actually accounts for her survival, and it is worth naming plainly because it is easy to let the drama of Trafalgar and the tragedy of Nelson's death overshadow the much longer, much less dramatic story of the shipwrights and caulkers and volunteers who kept her from following her sisters into the breaker's yard. The larger meditation this suggests is not really about ships at all, though ships make it visible in a way few other objects can. It is about the peculiar relationship between craft and time, between the things human hands make and the centuries those things are asked to survive. Every empire that Victory served has changed beyond recognition. The navy that built her fought under sail and grape shot. The navy that maintains her today operates submarines and satellite communications. The war she was built to help win, against a France that seemed in the 1760s likely to dominate Europe for a generation, has receded into distant history, its urgency impossible now to feel except through study and imagination. And yet the hull persists. Oak and iron and paint holding, however imperfectly, the shape of a world that no longer exists anywhere else, not in living memory, not in any other surviving structure of comparable scale and detail. She is not a relic in the sense of being inert, a fossil embedded in rock. She is closer to a language still spoken by a shrinking number of people, kept alive through use and care, rather than through mere preservation in a glass case. And, like any language kept alive that way, she changes slightly, even as she persists. Each repair a small negotiation between fidelity to what was and the practical requirements of what must be done to keep her standing. Toward evening, when the dockyard empties and the last visitors have filed back toward the museum buildings and the modern harbour beyond, the ship settles into the kind of quiet that seems to belong more to her own century than to this one. Lantern light, or its electric imitation, now falls across the gun decks in long bars between the timbers, catching the grain of 200-year-old oak beside oak laid only decades ago, indistinguishable to the eye though the record could tell them apart. The lower decks, where hundreds of men once slept in swaying hammocks, slung so close together that shoulders nearly touched, hold nothing now but stillness and the faint smell of tar and old wood that dockyard workers say never quite leaves a ship of her age. Somewhere in the structure, as the temperature shifts with the coming night, a timber creaks, a small settling sound, the kind of noise that during her sailing years would have been utterly unremarkable. One voice among thousands in the constant conversation of a wooden hull moving with wind and water, and which now, in the silence of a dry dock at rest, sounds almost deliberate, almost like a ship reminding the empty air that she is still, in whatever sense matters, here. The dry dock around her holds no water, only the shape of a berth built to her exact measure, and in that stillness she seems less like a museum piece than like something paused mid-voyage, waiting, as she waited for so many years in the peace after Trafalgar, for a war that will not come again, tended now not for battle, but for memory, kept upright and whole by hands that never knew her captains and never will, carrying forward a story that began with felled oaks in a Sussex forest and a keel laid down in 1759, and has not yet, after all these years, reached its final chapter. If this chronicle of a single remarkable hull has been good company for a quiet hour, there are other great ships waiting in the same slow telling, other keels laid down in other centuries, other launches and voyages and long fates, gathered gently on this channel for anyone who wants to sit with them a while longer.